All right, it's 1:20, so we'll go ahead and start our third session. One of the themes of this symposium is why long-term monitoring is critical to protecting the Port Royal Sound for future generations. The talks in this third and final session describe monitoring programs of recreational fish, dolphins, and shorebirds, and the information that can be gained from these kinds of studies. At the conclusion of this session, we will have a roundtable discussion about this among the speakers about what still needs to be learned about the Port Royal Sound in order to protect it. So with that, we'll start off session 3 with Dr. Joseph Ballenger, Estuarine Finfish and Shark Scientist at Marine Resources Division of South Carolina DNR. He'll talk to us about trends in recreational fish populations. So turn it over to you, Joey. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Chris, and bear with me while I get the talk up here real quick. Just to confirm, you guys can't see my slideshows now, correct?
Correct, yes.
All right, well, yeah, thanks, Chris, for the introduction, and thanks for inviting me to talk a little about trends in recreational fish populations in South Carolina. As we have been seeing that in our long-term fishery monitoring programs, and hopefully what you'll come away from this is the value of those long-term data sets, not only for Port Royal Sound, but for state overall. But before I get started, one thing I did want to do is to, hold up one second. I want to thank the donors of the Spring Island Trust for partially funding this work and the work that Elizabeth Buller presented on earlier today. Their funding has allowed myself and my staff additional time to be able to vet the data coming directly from Port Royal Sound and start contrasting that with what we're seeing from other regions. So just wanted to put that out there first and forefront. So you may be asking, why is symposium about the ecological and cultural importance of Port Royal Sound? Am I showing a picture of Italy's topography? It's because the management of living resources in the Western world, including those in Port Royal in the United States and hence Port Royal Sound, can be traced to ideals codified in the 6th century by the Byzantine Empire by Justinian I in his Institutes and Digests. He was the first person who codified Roman civil law, which in turn became important to the public trust doctrine, which is one of the far-ranging and most influential pieces of property law in the United States. And as such, is very important to the management of living resources in the US. He identified many things to be held in common for the enjoyment of all mankind, including the living resources living within the sea. The Institute also identifies the right of fishing in the sea from the shore as belonging to all men. These concepts were to become the backbone of the public trust doctrine as applied in the US at both the state and the national level. The doctrine identified living marine resources as a trust held by the state or nation for the benefit of the public, which includes, not most importantly, current generations and future generations. The states or nations had the duty as the trustees to protect the trust for the public with the purpose of preserving and ensuring the public's ability to use and enjoy public trust resources for certain public uses, one of which continues to be fishing. This basically gave the states the statutory authority to govern and manage the public trust for the best interest of the public. However, states want to use the best scientific information available when determining how to be good stewards of the resources. This implies management decisions are not based off of opinion, but rather based upon data developed from surveys of the public, the fishery, and fishery-independent scientific observations on the health of species and watersheds. To this end, the inshore fisheries section at SCDNR was developed to study the trends in population abundance and demographics of estuarine and coastal shark species found throughout coastal South Carolina, including those in Port Royal Sound. This team is responsible for conducting the monitoring and research required to make science-based management decisions. Currently, our group maintains 5 distinct fishery-independent monitoring programs along the South Carolina coast. The electrofishing survey shown in pink, our travel net survey shown in yellow, our adult red drum and shark longline survey shown in green, our Estuarine trawl survey finfish monitoring program that Mike Kendrick talked about earlier in blue, and then our cooperative Atlantic States shark pupping and nursery ground survey in purple. These programs are set up to cover large swaths of coastal South Carolina, with the goal being to monitor the relative abundance and population demographics of priority species through time along the coast. Each generally targets a specific habitat type, with these monitoring programs also providing a mechanism through which we conduct additional research studies to advance our understanding of coastal ecosystems, much like Elizabeth's work that she was talking about earlier today. Of these, 3 have been operating in Port Royal Sound for at least a portion of their history. Those being the adult red drum and shark longline survey, still shown in green. The Trout Net survey, still shown in yellow, with specific sample sites shown. And the Estuarine trawl finfish bycatch program that Mike Kendrick talked about earlier. The longest continuously running survey in Port Royal Sound, commencing in 2007, is our adult red drum and shark longline survey. This survey targets channels and channel edge habitats at the entrances of estuaries and adjacent nearshore waters. As the name suggests, it targets adult red drum and coastal shark species, though it has encountered greater than 50 species across coastal South Carolina. And this survey uses large hooks, 15-knot mustad circle hooks with large baits, meaning we are really targeting larger fish with this survey. This survey only operates seasonally from August through mid-December annually across those 4 primary estuaries that I mentioned earlier: Port Royal Sound, St. Helena Sound, Charleston Harbor, and Winyah Bay from south to north. By far, the 2 most common species encountered in this survey in Port Royal Sound are Atlantic sharp-nosed shark and red drum, with other common species including things like blacktip sharks, black-nosed sharks, and a host of other elasmobranch species. And in fact, a total of 42 finfish and elasmobranch species have been encountered by this survey in Port Royal Sound since 2007. The species I want to highlight from this survey is red drum, a species of immense recreational importance for the state of South Carolina. As you're going to see several of these, let me take a second to orient you to these graphs. Along the x-axis will be year. Along the y-axis is going to be relative abundance, where relative abundance is relative to the average catch of the given survey from 2010 through the present, which also corresponds to the horizontal black dashed line, such that the relative abundance at any given year is telling you whether those catches in that year were below average, if below the line, or above average, if above the line. For red drum encountered by this survey, they seem to increase in relative abundance for the first couple of years of the survey, peaking in, 2014, before declining to lower but stable levels since 2017, with those levels being pretty similar to what was observed in 2010 and 2011. Once again, the pattern observed in Port Royal Sound generally agrees with the coastwide pattern of adult red drum relative abundance, which I'm now showing here in the blue line. This is expected based on the mobility of this species and most finfish or elasmobranch species, and in general is a feature observed for most finfish and elasmobranch sampled by this survey and others along coastal South Carolina. Keep in mind, this survey of red drum I'm showing here, as the name says, mainly encounters large adult red drum, with most individuals encountered being greater than 80 centimeters total length. You convert that to inches, greater than 32 inches total length. The second longest running survey we have been operating in Port Royal Sound is our Trout Net survey. With sampling commencing in Port Royal Sound in 2010, as Elizabeth mentioned earlier, the sampling in other South Carolina estuaries started as early as 1991. This survey targets lower estuaries, salt marsh edge, and oyster reef habitats of 5 South Carolina estuaries from south and north, again, Port Royal Sound, the specific sampling location shown in yellow in the map, along with St. Helena Sound, Charleston Harbor, Cape Romaine, and Winyah Bay. The idea is to capture finfish species, many of which are recreationally important, using these habitats during their life. Specific target species include red drum, spotted sea trout, and southern flounder. But once again, we catch many more species than that, with over 120 different species being encountered over the life of the survey. This survey makes use of a special type of monofilament net called a trammel net. These nets are 3-paneled and designed to either gill or bag fish. And if you want more information on the trammel net, I do have a brief 2-minute video I could show at the end or show during a break later on that tells you a lot more information about the trammel net. The survey operates year-round throughout coastal South Carolina with sampling of at least some estuaries during every month of the year, with those being chosen to be sampled in a given month being randomly chosen. So when we look at the species the survey most commonly encounters in Fort Royal Sound, number 1 is spot, a recreationally important species. Though this species is only number 5th most common in the survey overall across all of coastal South Carolina since 2010. In Fort Royal Sound, we caught 2018 spots since 2010, and overall we caught just over 13,000. I want to point that there because you see other species, those numbers will correspond to either the Fort Royal Sound catch or the coastwide catch. Number 2 is striped mullet, which is also the 2nd most common across the entire state. Number 3 is red drum, which is also the third most common across the entire state since 2010. But if we look back to the full time series, it's actually number 1 most common species encountered by the survey. And last but not least, another recreationally important species, spotted sea trout, which is number 4 in both the Fort Royal Sound, or number 4 in the Fort Royal Sound area, but the most common species since 2010 in this survey. Though it does encounter other species of recreational importance, such as southern flounder, black drum, and sheepshead. And it also provides some interesting information on non-finfish species, such as blue crabs, horseshoe crabs, diamondback terrapins, and green sea turtles. The survey has actually encountered 69 different species in Fort Royal Sound since sampling commenced in 2010. So the first species I want to highlight once again is red drum. Once again, the iconic estuarine species across coastal South Carolina. While the longline survey encountered adult red drum, this trammel net survey is designed to capture subadult, slot-sized, or legally harvestable sized fish, with the most common ages encountered being age 1, age 2, and age 3 fish, with a few fish encountered up to age 5 or even age 6+. What we note for red drum in Fort Royal Sound is it appears the population is declining substantially in the early years of the survey, but perhaps a slight increase with higher highs and higher lows since 2015. So I'll go ahead and foreshadow, I'm not really confident in that increase. That's because when we compare the Fort Royal Sound trend of relative abundance to the statewide trend over the entire time series, we see a much larger decline in the relative abundance of red drum overall since the early 1990s, when catches were 3 to 4 times the average catch since 2010. Shown here. This shows the importance. That said, the trend since 2010 statewide and in Fort Royal Sound appears to be relatively similar, low but stable as what we're seeing. This shows the importance of these long time series when assessing the health of the population, as you might come to a different conclusion based on the shorter time series. Related to the trend in red drum abundance, we have also conducted a high reward tagging study throughout coastal South Carolina that a current graduate student within our section is currently analyzing the data for. This study was conducted on slot-sized harvestable red drum, and we were trying to determine, using the study, to develop direct estimates of recapture rates of red drum in coastal South Carolina and reporting rates of tagged fish by recreational anglers. The first thing I'm showing from the study is the recapture rate of red drum by estuary and across the combined coast. A typical recapture rate for a marine or even freshwater fish, based on a market recapture study, is on the order of about 5%. What we are seeing for red drum is a recapture rate in excess of 25% in both Port Royal and Charleston Harbor, and over 20% across the entire state. This is suggestive of high fishing pressure and or low population sizes, which supports our relative abundance trend of subadult red drum encountered by the TravelNet survey shown previously. Also from the high reward study, we get estimates of tag reporting rate, the primary parameter of interest actually for why we conducted this study, which overall are pretty high across coastal South Carolina, suggesting red drum anglers are willing to report their tag returns. But notably, the lowest reporting rate was observed in Port Royal Sound at around 60%. The second species I'd like to highlight is southern flounder. Once again, if we look at the data from Port Royal Sound alone, it appears the southern flounder population has been relatively stable over the survey history, bouncing around the long-term average of 2010. It's only when we look at that longer-term survey data that once again we see this overall declining pattern of southern flounder across the state overall. This was masked by that shorter time series in Port Royal Sound, as much of the decline we have seen across the entire state occurred prior to the commencement of sampling in the region. In fact, once again, catches of southern flounder in this survey were 3 to 4 times the average catch since 2010 in the early 1990s. The final recreational species I thought I would highlight is spotted sea trout. Here we see a slightly different pattern with an apparent increase in relative abundance since 2010. An interesting feature of this species is its susceptibility to environmental conditions, particularly cold winters that periodically lead to fish kills in our estuaries. We know such fish kills of spotted sea trout occurred in 2010, 2011, and 2018. Thus, that means that likely what we're seeing when this survey commenced in 2010 was the effect of those fish kills lowering the relative abundance at that point in time and then recovery after the fact. This is seen even more clearly when we look at the pattern across the entire state based off of TravelNet data. There we have documented fish kills in not only the 3 I've already mentioned, but also in 2001, which each of these winter kill events lead to sharp declines in spotted sea trout relative abundance in that year, followed by a steady increase in abundance in the following years. The last survey that monitors finfish in Port Royal Sound is the Estuarine trawl survey that Dr. Kendrick introduced you guys to before lunch. It was originally designed to provide information on the relative abundance and population dynamics of shrimp and crustaceans. I guess they're both crustaceans, shrimps and blue crabs. In 2011, though, we began monitoring the Estuarine trawl survey finfish bycatch during their monthly Charleston Harbor trawls and on the April, August, and December south trips of the survey, which include those stations in Port Royal Sound that Mike talked about earlier. I will note this survey typically encounters small size classes of many estuarine species, and in general encounters a different community than encountered by either the TravelNet or Longline survey, with over 120 species being recorded since finfish monitoring began in 2011. These species include many that aren't regularly sampled in other surveys, including things like star drum, black cheek tonguefish, silver perch, bay anchovies, spotted hake, and hog choker. But the one primary recreational fish species we see here that we don't see elsewhere is weakfish. This species, while not the most common in South Carolina, is a highly sought after sport fish. At the same time, multiple regional assessments suggest this species is depleted throughout its range and has been experiencing overfishing for decades. When we look at the relative abundance of weakfish in Port Royal Sound, we seem to get an indication of increasing abundance from 2011 through 2015, but then we see a decline in abundance through 2021. I'll just note that no sampling was conducted during 2020 due to COVID protocols during the period of time when we would expect weakfish to occur. The pattern becomes even a little clearer when we look at the coastwide data, with seeming increase from 2011 to 2019. The last couple of years have been slightly lower, and only time will tell if that's a sort of a short-term decline or the overall increasing pattern will resume once again. So this is just a brief snapshot of some of the data we have available regarding finfish and elastomeric ranks being derived from inshores fishery independent monitoring programs. Other data available from these surveys include data for a host of other species, day and site level information on environmental conditions, population demographic information on size distributions and age compositions, additional life history parameters or life history information, etc., including some targeted studies and specific systems to look at the potential impacts of different things. Most notably, one that we just wrapped up recently was a microplastic study in Charleston Harbor. One thing that is clear is the value of long-term data sets. It's only with these data one can detect changes in population abundances or demographics. Most scientists consider a minimal time length of 10 years for such survey data to be valuable to assessments of population health. With each year, the survey extends beyond that, increasing its utility. The effect of the longer time series was most dramatically shown here when we compared those longer statewide indices of abundance from the TravelNet survey to those shorter series from Fort Worth Sound. However, when interpreting data from Fort Worth Sound, one must always be cognizant of the uniqueness of the sound with regards to its hydrology. As others have mentioned earlier, Fort Worth Sound behaves differently than our other coastal estuaries, mostly because of the lack of freshwater input and natural depth of the sound, depth of the harbor. It's also the southernmost large estuary in South Carolina, meaning it tends to have slightly warmer water temperatures on average. This has numerous effects, not the least of which appears to be a higher use of this estuary by some marine-dependent species who cannot tolerate low salinities, as well as some more tropical or subtropical species we sometimes encounter in this watershed. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
One question is, are there any indications that similar trends in relative abundance for these key species can be extrapolated to the greater southeastern region as opposed to just the South Carolina coastal zone?
So it's highly dependent on the individual species. Southern flounder is one that we have seen declines in their relative abundance, not only here in South Carolina at the Port Royal level, South Carolina level, but we've also seen it more regionally along the entire Atlantic coast and even extending into the Gulf of Mexico as well. So we do see that in certain species. Red drum, we've seen some declines in other places as well, but not as steep of a declines as what we seem to be seeing here along the South Carolina coast. For things like spotted sea trout that have a fairly narrow home range, we see a lot less synchrony in what the relative abundance is doing over those larger geographic areas.
Okay. Eric says, great talk. Joey, do you know if spot and star drums spawn offshore or within the estuaries?
Spot spawn within no, they spawn offshore. They thought is that spot predominantly spawn off the Cape Hatteras, but that they thought that for a lot of species, but it's at least known they spawn offshore. Don't know anything about star drum life history. I apologize.
Right. Not too many people go fishing for star drum.
Yes.
Sometimes I have a question as far as sometimes locals talk about the fact that the association between sea trout eating juvenile red drum and vice versa. If there's an absence of sea trout, does it make it so that red drum have the opportunity, because they're so abundant, have the opportunity to have higher survivorship, or numbers of juveniles might be higher for red drum and vice versa?
Yeah, so that is something that we've actually noted historically, at least in our statewide data sets. If you plot the spotted sea trout statewide index along with the red drum, it seems to be when red drum are improving, spotted sea trout sometimes go down. So we thought there may be a connection there. I plotted it more recently in the last few years, and it seems like that sort of relationship may be breaking down a little bit. We're not really sure what the cause of that is at this point in time. So,
okay. Last question, as we are seeing an increase of manatee and sea turtle migration coming up from Florida, are you seeing any changes in migration of species coming into the Port Royal area from the south?
I don't know that we necessarily are seeing what we can really call a difference in the migration. There is some indication that we may be starting to see some more frequent occurrences of more typically Florida type species, like common snook. We're starting to encounter everywhere in some places. That's not just Port Royal Sound, but along the entire coast. Tarpon we've seen a bit more frequently than we used to. Not really sure what's going on there. Atlantic tripletail is another one. I think there's a pretty sizable Atlantic tripletail fishery developing in Port Royal Sound. We don't encounter them enough at this point in time to really track their relative abundance in our surveys, but there's at least some indication that the probability of occurrence may be increasing recently.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you again, Joey.